Well, as a political writer, I always think it's good to have economists around, but it's quite formidable to follow this bevy of them. However, we'll try. It will be a while, I think, before we know the long-term political impact of Tuesday's budget. But it is clear at this early stage that the government has put a lot of weight in its saddlebags early in its term. And I think this has come about basically for three reasons. Firstly, Tony Abbott took out far too much insurance before the elections with his promises that almost certainly he didn't need to make, not all of them. Secondly, the coalition exaggerated the budget crisis it faced, reducing its flexibility. And thirdly, ideology has been given too much rein in this budget. The Abbott promises were a constraint on framing the budget, and then they were a curse when some, or indeed many, were broken. They were so extensive that breaches were always going to be inevitable. The coalition had trapped itself. It played the short-term pre-election politics more than it had to, and then it's paid the price by sacrificing its longer-term credibility in office. How it ever thought it was going to get away with such extensive breaches after it had so effectively used the trust card against Julia Gillard is, I must say, something of a mystery. The government became victim, I think, of its own propaganda, its sense of economic and political righteousness. To use another description, its own hubris. It thought that it could do what Gillard did in trashing promises, in her case really a single promise, because it wasn't Labor. But one message from today's polls is that it becomes obvious that, at least in the immediate term, people are very willing to apply the same standards to both sides of politics. So they marked the Gillard government down for a breach of promise. They're marking the Abbott government down for its broken promises. If the government had not overhyped its description of the fiscal situation, a situation, I think, that was more of a difficult problem, certainly in the medium term, than a crisis, it would not have had to resort to such extreme measures. Some of what it's done in the budget on middle-class welfare, health and so on would have been much more acceptable if framed in more moderate terms. Yet there's been a contradiction in regard to its own insistence that the fiscal situation is so bad that such harsh measures are inescapable. For example, all the government revenue that's saved from the co-payment is going into the new medical research fund rather than going to the budget bottom line. And this is presumably to deal with the issue of the pre-election pledge that we won't cut health. But in fact, it represents a distortion, worthy as the medical research fund is in itself. And Joe Hockey's argument that investing in research now will in fact find cures and save the health scheme money later, I think is just an example of a total stretch in logic, because I don't think anyone thinks that however good Australian research is, it's going to find these massive breakthroughs in such a way that suddenly, or even over the long term, health costs are greatly reduced. It doesn't work like that. The government also set up criteria for judging the budget, which in fact have come back to bite it. For example, it talked much when there was a leak, in this case an unintended leak. Most of those leaks were very strategic and almost all given out to News Limited, but the one that appeared in News Limited about the high income levy, the first one, was in fact a genuine unintended leak. And when it was defending that proposed levy, it talked a lot about fairness. Ministers said, well, if you're going to have a budget where everyone does the heavy lifting, sounding like some bodybuilding contest, I must say, but anyway, that was the language they used, then you have to deal with the higher income earners, and the only way is to do that when it in fact goes to the tax side. But the trouble was, when the actual budget came out, it was quite clear that even with that tax hike, in fact, the budget, as has been mentioned before by the earlier speakers, is not fair. The lifting is indeed being done disproportionately by those further down the scale. So the government had set up the criteria, everyone looked at the fairness thing, and in fact in today's Nielsen poll, some 6 in 10 plus people condemn the budget as not fair, and this is far more than have found previous budgets over many years to be not fair. Ideology, as well as its own rhetoric, pushed this budget into overreach. Joe Hockey has become obsessed by the whole idea of ending the age of entitlement. And this budget does have the mark of Joe Hockey all over it. Hockey, incidentally, is obviously an aspiring leader for the future, and that came through very much, I think, in the speech he gave on Wednesday, the traditional post-budget speech, which often focuses very heavily on the data and the ins and outs of the budget, but in Hockey's case was very much about values. Now, again, it's a matter of degree. I think that most people these days would think that we do need to target measures more carefully to need, that some measures have become excessive, that you can't do things that maybe 20 years ago were able to be afforded. But this budget, for ideological reasons, I think has taken that far too far. Now, one might have thought that Tony Abbott would be a moderating force in these budget preparations. And he did chair the Expenditure Review Committee all through, which doesn't always happen in the preparation of a budget. Sometimes that chairing, in fact, goes to the Treasurer. But he wasn't that moderating force. And I think there's quite an interesting question to be raised as to why that was. Tony Abbott has had a number of positions on key policy areas over the years. Of course, we all remember the climate change weather vane comment, but also if you have a look at Battle Lines, his book, he has a quite different view on means testing than he does these days. But if we ask why he wasn't more of a moderating force, it does raise the question of whether he's become a real convert to the philosophy of ending the age of entitlement, or whether he judged that that's where the Liberal Party's centre of gravity now is, and he didn't think that it was prudent or possible to be more pragmatic in some areas. Abbott's personal authority and reputation, I think, has taken an enormous hit from this budget. And politically, that is one really important message out of what's happened. Just as Julia Gillard was effectively branded a liar, so that is now how Labor is now describing him. And in a sense, the government's not putting up much of a fight when that term is used. And I think this does have very important implications for both Abbott and for the government. The government has a big agenda coming up, an ambitious agenda with white papers on tax and on federalism and a productivity commission inquiry into industrial relations, and that's just some of the items. Now, these will produce substantial and controversial measures which the government will take, some of them at least, to the 2016 election. And it's hard to see how Abbott can convincingly carry what will be, in any circumstances, quite a difficult election campaign. His problem in trying to repair his credibility is partly that he's never had a huge basis of popularity. We're not talking here like of a Prime Minister like, for example, Bob Hawke, who started really popular, and therefore, even though he had setbacks at various times, he was able to repair and recover. Abbott is not naturally a politician who people are inclined to forgive. Now, I'm not seriously raising leadership speculation here, but I'd merely say that it would be an interesting situation if the coalition trailed Labor for a very long time. The government, I think, has several immediate problems. One is the states, and I can't see it doing much for them in the wake of their complaints, but with 3 Liberal premiers facing election, the squeals are unlikely to stop, and that will be a big irritant for the government. The second problem is the Senate, with Labor, the Greens and Palmer threatening a raft of measures. Now, not all those threatened measures will be blocked. For example, I think the 2 tax rises, petrol and the income tax rise, should be all right because there won't be the required pairings to vote them down. On some measures, the government will undoubtedly have to compromise, and I think it will lose some others. The Medicare co-payment does seem, at this point anyway, to be at high risk, with Labor and the Greens and the Palmerites all being very critical. And the crackdown on the dole for young people also, I think, is really unlikely, you would think, and again you have to stress on present indications, to survive in its current form. Some measures will be dealt with by the old Senate and others will carry through into the new Senate, and that's a further complication. How the Palmer party will behave when it comes to the point is, I think, one of the big unknowns in the aftermath of this budget. Now, Clive Palmer has been going around with firecrackers and essentially causing merry hell with them. But nevertheless, you have to raise a question about how flexible he will be. For example, on one thing, some of the higher education changes, he started off saying no, and he seems to have come round, I think, after a chat with Christopher Pyne. So there really is no roadmap to be able to predict how he will act. Even before the polls of today, I thought that a double dissolution, the talk of a double dissolution at some point, because Tony Abbott wanted to get rid of the Palmerites and not be under their thumb, as Labor was seen to be under the Greens' thumb, that talk seemed to me pretty fanciful. Such a gamble with a public as fickle as people are nowadays would be an enormous risk for the government. But I think certainly after the poll that we've seen today, the polling generally, we can forget the double dissolution talk. The last thing the voters would want in the next year or so is another election. And as for dealing with the Palmer party, well, the Nielsen poll had PUP on 6%, and the quota for a double dissolution is 7.69%. So you can see that the getting rid of exercise could go really badly wrong. The message certainly from the budget overreach is be very careful of any election overreach. Now, let me end briefly with a note about Bill Shorten. Both Newspoll and Nielsen have him leading decisively as preferred Prime Minister. But Shorten obviously is in that position solely because of Tony Abbott, rather than because of himself. This budget has obviously been a gift to the opposition, and at the moment Shorten is doing very well out of it, just like Abbott before him did very well being Dr. No. But Shorten's challenge is whether he can translate this advantage into a more permanent rebuilding for Labor. He has a great opportunity, but the problem he also has, I think, is that people won't forget quickly their criticism of Labor over the previous years. I'll leave it there. Thank you.